Welcome to Red Pill Nation. I'm Scott Veritas, and today I'm speaking with Bo Winegard. Bo is a commentator, podcaster, and academic who studies human population variation. You can follow Bo on Twitter at epo187 and subscribe to his podcast, Scyphilopod, by following the links in the description below. Bo, thank you for joining me on Red Pill Nation.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's good to talk to you, Bo. I said this about my last guest, and I'll say it about you. You're part of the cohort of sort of online commentators who fit in a sweet spot for me, where I know they will criticize the left when they think that it's necessary. They'll criticize the right when they think that it's necessary. They're not 100% predictable, like on one side 100% of the time. I find that gets very boring, and I'm not as interested in talking to people like that, frankly.
It means that you get to vex people from both sides, though.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I'm excited to talk to you, and I just wanted to start off by asking you about yourself for people that may not be familiar. So if you just want to kind of talk about your background, your story, how you ended up studying what you study, and how you ended up sort of in the position that you're in, doing the kind of commentary that you do.
So I would start by saying I haven't actually looked or studied human variation since I finished my last paper. I kind of let it go, and then I moved on. I'm studying human nature and conservatism and trying to write a book about that, but I will get to that. So I guess I'll just start with what I got interested in. I've always just been interested in intellectual things, reading, learning, etc. And I was originally in literary studies. I was going to write the great American novel before I was 25, but that never happened. but I was in literary studies, and I love literature, poetry, etc. But I left because I got interested in evolutionary psychology at about the same time, in my late teens, I suppose. And the field of literary studies was very hostile to evolutionary theory. I would try to write criticism, and I'd use some evolutionary theory in the criticism, and I would get very negative feedback. So it was all like Marxism, feminism, right. A lot of criticism based on theories that we know are untrue, Freudianism even.
Right.
So I just found that off-putting, and it was very biased. It was very left-wing biased, which I was on the left at the time, but I found it. It wasn't that it was left. It was also like hostile to free inquiry, free speech, and bringing in these different ideas. That was the problem. And also, I think there was a lot of I don't want to call it grift, but there were a lot of charlatans who were prominent, Jacques Lacan, Derrida, these postmodern philosophers that I wasted a lot of my early life reading these philosophers and discovering that they were full of shit, or what they did say that was correct was mostly banal and very difficult to get to because it was sort of hidden behind this wall
mired in nonsense.
Yeah, exactly. This nearly impenetrable jargon. So anyway, I left literary studies and went into psychology because I thought psychology sort of combined all of my interests, which were, literary studies, philosophy, and then more rigorous sciences like physics, etc., and even history, which is what I'm more interested in now. So I went into psychology. I took a very circuitous route through undergraduate, but I did start studying, or I got interested in human variation as an undergraduate. In fact, I remember my brother originally said, he was talking to me about the bell curve, which both of us had previously just dismissed as obvious quackery because, that's what everybody tells you. And
that's the reputation.
Right. And I'm embarrassed to say I didn't look into it for myself at the time. I was 22 or something. So, and my brother said one time when we were discussing the issue, he said, you should look into it. I've read it. It's actually very judicious, etc. And that shocked me. So I looked into it, and I'm not kidding you, I spent probably a year reading all of the arguments against the genetic hypothesis of human variation because I was so emotionally against it. I was a good person of the left. I wasn't on the PC left. I was on the more class-based Chomskyan left, I guess you would say. but
Yeah.
it was still a foreign idea to me that was a bit offensive to my moral worldview. So
Right.
I spent probably a year reading all of the arguments against it and finding them wanting. And I just concluded, if this is the best that the opponents have to offer here, then there's probably something to this view, right? And then I read the bell curve, for example, and it was a very judiciously worded, well-argued book, which was surprising to me because of the hysterical reaction to it.
Yeah.
And the gross mischaracterization, etc. But at this time, I thought, maybe I don't need to talk about this stuff publicly. And I was interested in a lot of other evolutionary psychology-based research. So I didn't get into that until grad school. So when I got into grad school with Roy Baumeister, who's, I don't know, one of the most prominent social psychologists around, great advisor for me to have, because very non-PC and very hands-off, let me do what I wanted to do, good to talk with, right? Yeah, it worked out well. When I got to grad school, that's when I started really noticing the bias against conservatives. So as an undergrad, I guess I just got lucky because I had prominent, not prominent, but the professors that I had, that I looked up to, that I worked with, were just about the science and they weren't biased. So I didn't see the bias the way other people did as an undergraduate. When I got to grad school, I started to notice it, not from my own advisor, but from other people and from other areas. That was right about the time that Jonathan Haidt gave the speech at SPSP about liberal bias, and everybody got hysterical about that. So I started getting more interested in that and more interested in human variation. I just thought, with the human variation stuff, it's such an interesting and exciting topic. And if you're going to study human evolution, you can't avoid it. And I just saw this paper. I just kept imagining this paper to myself about human psychological variation. It was just such a brilliant and obvious paper. And it was just sitting there waiting to be written because nobody would write it because they didn't want to get in trouble.
Right.
So I talked to a couple of professors about this, and they all told me, don't do it until you get tenure, which was probably good advice. But my brother and I kept bouncing this back and forth and just like, somebody's got to write this. If we don't, somebody else is going to. So that's how I got into it. And in fact, Nicholas Wade wrote, he was a science reporter for the New York Times. He wrote a book called A Troublesome Inheritance. And I think it came out in 2015. And that was about human variation. And that was right around the time my brother and I were gearing up to write an article on this. And I was excited about the book. And I was like, see, somebody's going to write about this stuff. It's just sitting there. Of course, Wade got furiously denounced, and it was actually worse than I expected. I mean, I figured it would get denounced by people, but
yeah,
the reaction was absolutely, bonkers and incredibly disproportionate, and in many ways dishonest, which I can get into later if anybody wants to know what I mean by that. But that provoked me. I was like, all right, we're gonna do this then. Like, this is
double down.
Just the intellectual hypocrisy of all of these people claiming it's all about the science, trust the science, that's the big thing now. But even at the time, these liberals who would pride themselves on being the party of science, and we're about the science. And these conservatives are Darwin deniers. They don't even believe in evolution. And yet they don't accept the obvious sort of corollary or the natural consequence of natural selection, which is that it happened above the neck and that you have variation in human brains within races, between sexes, and among races. So that's what we wrote a paper on that. Still probably one of my favorite articles. Had a lot of trouble getting it published, of course, but did eventually get it published. Wrote some other articles on other stuff, not terribly interesting to me anymore, but and then I got on the job market. I had a pretty productive graduate career, got on the job market, and had a terribly difficult time.
Yeah.
I think I applied to, I'd have to check, but I'm going to say it was upward of 90 colleges and universities, and I think I got one phone interview and then one job offer out of that. And I people are welcome to look at my record on Google Scholar or whatever and see how it compares to an average person's on the job market. Also, I had Roy Baumeister as my advisor. So it's not as if I was coming from nowhere. I mean, this is one of the most famous psychologists. So it's hard not to believe that at least some of this was ideologically motivated, right? Because it just takes one person on the hiring committee to say, you know what, I don't like that.
Right.
And across this period of time, I should say, I went from this kind of quasi-Chomskyan leftism to I became more and more sympathetic to centrism and even conservatism, and we can get into that. So by the time I was on the job market, I was very disgruntled with what we might call the PC left, right? And I considered myself a centrist at the time, but I had a lot of sort of conservative views underlying that. So anyway, got a job, continued to write on human variation, which turns out it was, maybe a mistake. So I ended up, unfortunate events, I ended up getting fired. So now I am I guess I call myself an independent scholar. I'm interested in history, really American history especially, and conservative political philosophy, and sort of putting that together with human nature. That's kind of my goal now, is looking at, in my argument is that conservative political philosophy is most congruent with human nature of the sort of political ideologies that are available. Yeah. And I want to try to make that case.
Yeah, I think, your story, Bo, without getting into like the finer details, of course, you were eventually fired, and it was a result of just being a curious person who was interested in science and telling the truth about things. And I think it's a story that unfortunately we see time and time again now. You're one of a few prominent examples, and then for every prominent example is an example that's flown completely under the radar. Right. One thing I wanted to ask you, having incurred a personal cost as a result of your interests and as a result of your speech, is what do you think makes somebody do what you did? Because going into it, I know you may not have had an idea of exactly what would happen, but you knew that you were doing something risky and that could cost you. What do you think makes someone like yourself, someone like a Brett Weinstein or a Jordan Peterson or myself? I've also had similar situations. I actually worked in politics in the Democratic Party, and eventually not so much. Yeah. So I had quite the journey, but without getting into that.
It's a good question. I ask myself that question quite often, in fact. I think I have a positive explanation and a negative explanation, and both are probably somewhat true. On the negative side, or I guess you could see it as a negative, I have what you would call a reactive personality. So if you tell me that I can't do something, I want to do it, right? And
I can relate.
I hope that that's not completely gratuitous, but it can manifest gratuitously. But also on the positive side, and I think people who know me would say this, so like I have plenty of flaws, but there's this Nick Carraway, the narrator of The Great Gatsby, says something like, everybody suspects himself of having one cardinal virtue. I think my cardinal virtue is intellectual honesty. I find it really hard to lie about intellectual topics or to bullshit or whatever. And I just felt as though it would be hypocritical of me not to talk about these issues and not to answer questions honestly that I knew, or I strongly believed to be true. And at minimum, I thought we should debate. And I'm not dogmatic about it. I have my views, of course, and I would promote those views, but I would also, more importantly, promote generous debate about them. And that I just couldn't stand the hypocrisy of academia and these people preening their feathers about scientific inquiry and free inquiry, and we are so dedicated to this, and this is what makes science better than religion. And then they completely undermined those values and did precisely the
180
opposite.
degrees.
Yeah,
it's
yes.
very jarring.
Yes, yeah, exactly. It's really, it's jarring, it's disconcerting to somebody who cares about fairness. Now, I would say that concern with fairness, although I think it's ultimately good that humans are concerned about fairness, in the immediate for individuals, it's bad. I think it can be bad. And we're going to talk, I think, about tribalism. And this is, this is a big problem with tribalism, is that if you're somebody who's willing to be intellectually honest about the shortcomings of your own tribe, then you don't get as much status in that tribe, because unsurprisingly, people in the tribe don't want you to criticize them. People in academia don't want to be criticized, or whatever it happens to be. So unfortunately, I guess you have to pay a price in the immediate for this.
Yeah, I think that I actually really like the way you describe that sort of cardinal virtue. It's something I can relate to, and that I think probably is a through line in people that are finding themselves kind of in our cohort, which is that there is a painful, like there's a pain you feel in lying in an intellectual space that not everyone has. Some people, it is actually their natural position to just go where the wind blows. And for a lot of people, I know Peterson has a video, I can't remember who was interviewing him, but he described the almost sense of coming apart and the pain that you feel when you are kind of forced into, because it's almost like a submission. And, almost everyone, and I'll certainly concede of having, people will have the experience that I've definitely had back when I was in the Democratic Party as an operative, in that there are moments where you just kind of cave, like little moments, like even if you have this virtue, you'll have little moments where you're like, okay, let me just kind of like humor this person or whatever, because I don't want to deal with the consequences. And it will bother you for like several nights. Like you will be kept up at night thinking about, like, I almost wish I had just told that person exactly what I think. And I think that's I think that leads well to the kind of the tribalism topic, because as society becomes more tribal, that particular thing becomes a huge liability. That if you're not willing to just sort of like pick a team and stick to that team, like it's sort of like, it's almost like prison gangs. You need the protection. I mean, you do, seriously. It's like, if you're not, and you may be someone, if you're in a prison, you hear the stories about a guy who's like, I'm not even, a white supremacist, but the Aryan Nation were the only guys that would like keep me from getting beat up in jail. And it's like, that's a very extreme metaphor, but it almost sort of plays out how this tribalism thing has forced people to just say things that they don't necessarily believe. And I'm not really sure what the solution to that is, unless there's a space that is created where there's some safety or even some incentive for what I think is a good virtue and a good behavior to display, which is this: when you just say what you actually think. And if you don't necessarily know something, say that you don't know. Because it's Douglas Murray who says, we're not only pretending that we know things that we don't know, we're pretending that we don't know things that we absolutely know.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So yes, it's a complicated issue, because you get rewards for towing the line. Now, I should say, as a premise of this, I don't think that there's anything wrong with the sort of human propensity for tribalism. I think it can be a really healthy thing, and that the sort of sense of belonging that a person can get from a larger group is really good, and we should satisfy that need. And even in political parties, and if that means, especially if you're a politician, if that means that you have to discipline yourself and be a part of an institution and realize, you know what, maybe I shouldn't pop off at the mouth every thought that comes in my head, I think that's fine. I mean, I understand that. That's perfectly reasonable. The question is, where do you draw the line, right? Where does it become? So in science, I think you have to be, it's just free inquiry, right? Because science is a different game from politics. So I would distinguish the two. I would say in politics, I don't expect Barack Obama to give a talk on group differences in IQ, right? I don't think that's his job. He's a politician. He has different duties. No, I don't think he should lie, but I don't think he needs to talk about every issue that pops in his head. And I think the same holds for people in the Democratic Party. Where the problem is when people start actively lying, or they start dismissing or justifying behavior that's truly repellent and that they would excoriate on the other side. And now you see this in the case of Trump, for example. And this is an interesting thing that I noticed about my own sort of path, and because I actually went back and looked at some of my older tweets from, I don't know, 2017, 18, is I went from criticizing Trump a lot. I detested him since he became a public figure, to not criticizing him so much, to almost remaining silent about him, to then criticizing him again. And I think what happened is this. I thought that the sort of wokeism on the left was a greater problem at the time. And I was confronted with it more often because I was in academia, which is overwhelmingly liberal to progressive. And then I just got like a following of those people. And I think, I don't remember my emotions perfectly here, but it almost got to be the case that I was more afraid of criticizing the right than the left, which was weird because it had started, because all of my friends were on the left. That was harder to do. And then I almost felt as if I were in a different kind of prison.
So audience capture, I think.
Yes.
Is kind of
Yeah, that's it. That's right. It's like I heard somebody said this on a podcast I was just listening to, like, be careful about the audience. Oh, William Salatin. Be careful about the audience that you curate because you become a prisoner to them.
Yes.
Right. And it is true that I started feeling like I knew my audience. And I was like, I know I can do this and get 500 or 1,000 likes, and maybe I pick up 10 followers, or I can criticize Trump and get ripped on and lose 500 followers. And I hated that feeling. And I remember having it for like maybe a month where I really wanted to criticize Trump, but I was like, is it worth it? And I had been fired, so I was dependent on Patreon. I didn't want to lose Patreons, but I hated being in that prison. And so I just was like, no, I'm done with this, whatever. Like, there's an election coming up with Trump and Biden. And I think I don't like Biden. I don't like the Democratic coalition, but I really don't like Trump. And I'm going to be honest about that. And I was, and it did cost me a lot of followers, but it felt good. And I still think that's the case, that it's just clearly and manifestly the case that Trump is one of the most malignant personalities in public life. And I have been quite depressed to see some people of the IDW ignore Trump now. So they've went, everything woke is bad. And look, I basically agree with that. I am not a fan of wokeness, but a lot of these people will no longer criticize Trump or MAGAism because they're getting money from those people, or because that's where they get their prestige and their status. And you can see that the people who do criticize that aren't as popular. It's just, it is a cost that you have to play or pay, excuse me. And that's the kind of tribalism that I don't want, where you're willing to excuse the worst excesses of MAGAism and conspiratorial nonsense that's absolutely shameless because you hate the other side more. I think that's a problem.
Well, and yeah, I think, and people, it's pretty easy to, that there's like one or two people that really stand out as people who they haven't just, for me, I sort of can excuse people who are actively speaking out against the woke stuff, which I still generally consider to be the bigger threat because of its level of institutional influence.
That's a fair point. Yeah.
But I can sort of excuse people who they're speaking out always on that, and then they're just sort of you know, maybe every once in a while they say like, yeah, something Trump did was a little bit of it, but they kind of just ignore him. Because for a while that's what I did. And then the election fraud thing had me, and then I did lose a few subscribers from that, but thankfully not too many. I did come out and say like, this is ridiculous. We got to stop with this. But the thing that gets me is the people who actually have been very supportive of Trump and are just totally turning a blind eye to his flaws. And I think it's from person to person. I think for some of the people in the IDW or whatever you want to call it, it's more genuine for some than others. Some, it's clearly very unnatural. It's a weird alliance that just doesn't make any sense. And I can definitely think of like two people in particular, and I don't want to call anybody out, but you know,
we'll avoid individuals.
Yeah,
but
exactly. It's like there's a couple of people where it's just like they're not just ignoring him, they're actually actively supporting him and to making him out to be something he's not, which is this great person. They actually compliment him in ways that are almost comically just clearly wrong. I mean, like, this is not, I mean, I gotta, you know, I'll give a compliment to one person by name. I will always respect Ben Shapiro on the level that when I want to hear a conservative voice, like an establishment conservative voice, I often go to his show because he will criticize Trump pretty regularly, actually. And I often feel like Ben Shapiro is actually more critical of Trump than a lot of people who would call themselves classical liberals or whatever it is. It's actually kind of shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. You know, I think that's true. I mean, I have my disagreements with Shapiro, and I find him a bit divisive for my tastes, but I agree on that I think he's, by and large, he's an intellectually honest dude, and he can have a Matt Iglesias or an Ezra Klein on, and they can have a good conversation. And I appreciate that. And you're right. It is the so-called, a lot of so-called classical liberals forming an alliance with Trump is it's utterly baffling to me, because the Trump movement is incredibly illiberal. Now, this is very painful for me because I actually care about some of these policies, like immigration, for example. It's one of the policies I care the most about, one of the issues I care the most about. And the Trump administration, mostly through executive action, but they did some good things that actually decreased the flow of immigrants to the country, which I care about. I like that. That, in my view, for me, that's a policy victory, but it's not worth it. And I think I'd have to say that the people who were saying, look, you know, wokeism's a problem and we can get into what's worse, but I do think there's this institutional aspect that you talked about, which makes it particularly insidious. But there were people saying, look, Trump, you can't criticize wokeism all day long and not criticize Trump because he's clearly a danger. They were right. And they were right because we saw what happened after the election. Trump did the predictable thing. We could predict he would never concede, but it was even worse than I expected, because the Republican Party essentially capitulated to his narcissistic needs and allowed him to do this without really correcting him until it was too late. And that's dangerous. It's very dangerous that we have, I don't know, I'd have to check the latest Pew poll, but a large percentage of people, and no small reason because of the president's crazy conspiracy mongering, now believe that the election was fraudulent, right? And I think that's as crazy as any postmodern bullshit on the left.
Yeah.
And if you're going to criticize one, I just think you should criticize the other to be intellectually fair, reasonable, and to have a moral leg to stand on. Otherwise, people are just going to dismiss you as a partisan hack, and they should, right? Yeah. They should, because you are at that point just being a tribal pundit.
Exactly. And I the way that I framed it was that what happened at the Capitol, you can call it an insurrection. I've been mostly calling it a riot, but I'm not really interested in the semantic debate as much, but I'll call it a riot for the purpose of this conversation, because it helps with what I'm about to say, which is I looked at it as, okay, so you had this lie about the election that made people feel, because if you believed it, you could you could understand if somebody truly believed that an entire presidential election had actually been rigged, the level of fury you'd almost be morally obligated to riot. And that you see the mirror image of that on the left over the summer, where the lie is, what I said on Facebook after this happened was, riots are often the cost of lies, of long-standing, unchallenged lies. Because over the summer, we saw the lie that white police officers wantonly slaughter black people for no reason in the thousands on a yearly basis, when really it's closer to, there's 5 to 10 questionable situations per year that are caught on video. And it's easy to access that information, but these both rise to the level of conspiracies, of large scale, very, 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 very dangerous lies. And then we see the danger manifest itself in violence. And yes, a Capitol police officer died. Other people have died indirectly or somewhat in between, directly and indirectly, as a result of the riot at the Capitol. And like you said, if one good thing came out of January 6th, it was seeing like who is genuinely going to play both sides of things, and who's going to kind of, some people, I don't think Steven Crowder is interested in coming on my show. And I actually have some compliments for him. I think he can be very funny, but I remember he just posted like, "Oh man, I'm praying right now. This is not great." And that was like the extent of his commentary on the issue. And he had been playing up the election fraud stuff the whole time. And I was just like, come on, man. Like you've gotta, if you're going to be so passionate about what happened over the summer, as I was, as you were, you have to call this out. I mean, it was terrible, and people did die. It was a deadly act of politically motivated violence, whether or not you want to call it. I actually Michael Tracy has gone off on Twitter several times about, I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Tracy.
Yes, I am. Yeah, I follow him.
Yeah, and he's been saying that the whole idea it was a coup or insurrection is a little bit dramatic, and I tend to agree with him on that. But at the very least, it was a riot, and that makes it roughly equivalent to what happened although what happened over the summer went on for several months. And
it did.
Yeah.
Right. So I think you're right. They were both the sort of poisonous fruit of these pernicious
and inevitable
lies. Yeah, exactly. These lies that were the seeds of the poisonous fruit, and you could predict it. I mean, if you sincerely believe that Black Americans are being slaughtered by police officers, then you should go out and riot. And in fact, burning down property might be completely justified if it wakes up the establishment to
if you're saving thousands of lives, right? Yeah.
Same thing with the Capitol, right? Yeah. If you sincerely believe that not only did Trump win, or not only were there shenanigans during the election, but Trump won in a landslide. That's what he says, right? If you sincerely believe that, then rioting at the Capitol is at minimum morally justifiable, and maybe actually your obligation as a serious citizen of the Republic, right? So yeah, but now to the Michael Tracy point.
Yeah,
I think that I've had this debate with people, and Chris Rufo, for example, whom I very much respect, and he's a very good guy, and he's willing to debate, but he doesn't like the language of coup either, because he thinks that it will be used to justify this sort of crackdown on conservatives.
Yeah.
And I can understand that concern. Obviously, I don't want like a media crackdown on legitimate conservative views, and that there's reason to be concerned about that. However, I think coup is the appropriate term, and I actually do think it matters, because Trump literally wanted to overturn an election, a democratic election, and he tried everything in his power to do so. It's not as if he was just blundering around and like people randomly started a riot. No, he was promoting this massive lie from the second he lost. He called people in different states. We don't have the transcript from other states, but we have the transcript from Georgia, attempting to have people overturn the election counts in these states. And when he went to the January 6th speech, I mean, he called people there. A lot of the people who were there said they were there at the behest of Trump. And in fact, you could hear some of the people during the riot yelling, Trump invited us here, like we're here because of him, because they were using that as the moral justification. We were invited by the sitting president of the United States. Now, some people were violent before. I think the inciting the insurrection's not the correct way to put it, because the New York Times and other people have other outlets have shown some of the violence started before Trump's speech even. So it's not as if the people came there, Trump fired them up, and then they all got violent or rioted.
Right.
But he had fed this lie, and he wanted them explicitly to pressure weak Republicans to vote against certification so that he could overturn the election. And I have no doubt, and I'd like to hear if you have any doubt, that if Trump could have succeeded, he would have succeeded, and he would still be president. He would not resign or say, you know what, this isn't good for the country, or we're a republic, I'm not going to do this. He would absolutely do it. He would have no qualms about that.
Yeah, I definitely would. I will agree 100%. If Trump thought that, certainly if he thought that this gets a little bit hairy in that it's hard to get into the mind of Trump, but if I attempt to do so, and I will try, I will try. I've been struggling with exactly what he thought was going to happen, in that I always sort of use I can't remember, it's somebody's razor. It's like a philosophical principle that you can often attribute things that you might think are a result of malice to sheer stupidity. And I often say that Trump is malicious often, but I actually think he's more often just dumb and not thinking very strongly, very hard about things. And my read generally the situation is that Trump played up these lies, wanted to get people riled up 100%, and that if he thought he could, surely the thing I'll concede right off the bat is if he thought that he could get people to have this massive protest that maybe got a little rowdy and just kind of like was just this massive, because he thinks that everybody loves him and he's going to get, he's going to be billions and billions, people to come to the Capitol. Exactly how he would think of it. And that they're just going to make so much noise and be so rowdy that they're going to overturn the election, that he would surely be like, that's great. And I think that if in his head you had gone so far as to say maybe violence will take place and that will somehow come out in your favor, I think at the end of the day, he would be like, yes, let's do it. But I don't necessarily think that he intended to have them actually go in and assault police officers and break things, because what I noticed was that as soon as that started happening, he was like, wait, stop. He was, on Twitter immediately, there's like, do not attack the Capitol Police, go home. And it was actually fairly fast. It really didn't take that long. And so I think of it as sort of like he was doing something that he should have known would have this natural and almost inevitable consequence, but he wasn't quite smart enough to think that hard about it. But I don't know if he actually intended to have it become like a violent coup that would successfully overturn the elections through sheer intimidation and violence. I think he thought of it as more of like, people are going to shout so loud and love me so much and have such a presence that there will be sort of I guess it's still intimidation to an extent, but I don't know. It's difficult for me in that I don't think very highly of Trump, but I also I don't necessarily think that he actually thought there was going to be like a violent revolution at the Capitol. I think that he didn't have the foresight to see that exact thing. And the evidence of that is in his response to it pretty quickly turning into like, and surely he got a cell phone call from Mitch McConnell or whatever, and that may have been a part of it.
So I agree. I agree that I don't think he intended it to be violent. I think he wanted intimidation, and what you said, just like the best people will be there. So many people intimidating people. But I'm actually, I think I depart from your view of his post-riot behavior, because what actually horrified me, perhaps more than the riot, although that was horrifying, is that he behaved in such a dilatory and sort of like lackadaisical manner. And in fact, the video that he tweeted, I don't know, an hour and a half, 2 hours into this, was like this minute-long video. And it was basically
very bizarre, where he's like, you're all very special, but you have to go home. It's very weird. This
is what happens when an election is stolen. That's what he started. That was his preface. And then you have to go home, and then we love you. So just imagine Barack Obama gives this talk whips up a crowd of angry BLM supporters to go to the Capitol. Some are already there because he had invited them and had been, he'd been saying, our country is so systemically racist that we need to overturn this election to stop the systemic racism, right? And Obama had been promoting this for months, and then he did this. And then 2 hours into it, he sends a video out and says, this is what happens when you live in a country that's white supremacist, but you guys should kind of go home. I love you. I'll see you later. The meltdown among the right and among these IDW types, it would be epic. Their tweets would be endless about how we should go assassinate this person because he's a threat to our democratic republic. But when Trump does it, you get into these quibbles about, is it a coup? Is it an insurrection? Is it a riot? You know, I do think it matters. I'd call it a coup. We can have that debate. It's a fair debate, but like, it was terrible. Whatever it was absolutely atrocious and unforgivable. And you now have a Republican Party that is saddled with this sort of MAGA-ism, conspiratorial craziness that wants to troll libs more than pass policy. And you have Marjorie Taylor Greene, you have Lauren Boebert, you have Matt Gaetz, you have all of these people who are just, in my view, despicable human beings who are just out there performing, and they're not doing anything actually to make the lives of the working class people that I care about and that a lot of populists claim to care about better. And that's what I care about. And the other thing I try to tell people who are on my side on like the anti-woke stuff, or so on our side, is I care about the policies. And if you want to pass these policies, you have to persuade people in the center that they're not racist. So like, I want immigration restriction. I have to persuade the average person, this isn't because I'm somebody who hates people of color. It's because all of these, and then I have to forward legitimate reasons. When you get a Lauren Boebert or a Trump or a Matt Gaetz, they make it look bad and they actually alienate people, right? And there are plenty of polling on what happens, you know, like if you look at immigration, just for an example, people became much more liberal about immigration since the Trump presidency because his rhetoric was so divisive about it. And because these people spend more time trolling the wokes than they do trying to persuade people in the center. That's what I get disconcerted about. And I just think it ends up distracting from our not even distracting, it's actually positively harmful, and it handicaps our ability to persuade people in the center.
Yeah, this actually really touches on the criticism of Trump that I had mostly through last year because it was an election year. And I would try to explain to people how he has a brand that is 100% poisonous to 50 to 60% of the population. And that brand is considered, unfortunately, by many people to be the representation of anti-woke or anti-PC resistance, right? Because people have a very binary thought process. They think Democrats like political correctness, Republicans don't. Donald Trump is the leader of the Republican Party. And this manifested most directly in a very unfortunate way. It was I think the first presidential debate where there was many an unfortunate thing about that. But but the most tragic to me was when a question came up where I was like, boy, I really wish James Lindsay were up on that stage instead of Donald Trump, because the question was about the diversity trainings. That was how, Chris Wallace framed it. The critical race theory influenced kind of diversity trainings in the federal government. And Donald Trump just sort of like waffled back and just sort of was able to get out like, oh, it's like a reverse racism kind of thing. And he wasn't really very articulate when that was a moment where if James Lindsay, if yourself, if myself, if anyone that is a little more articulate and intelligent about these things was up on the stage, they could have had a moment where they could have really informed the American people. And that debate had a massive audience about what this thing is. And instead, what we got was Trump showing how bad he is for people like you and me, in that he's asked a question that is actually very important to us, and that in theory, I mean, to his credit, he did sign an executive order that improved the situation with those trainings by getting rid of them because they're awful. But he wasn't able to articulate the reasoning for that at all. And of course, Joe Biden handily won that portion of the debate. It ended with Donald Trump saying a weird thing about the Proud Boys that was kind of unintelligible. And it's just like, exactly. And it's just like, people like us are put in the position, and because, friends of ours might be like, well, you hate wokeness. So, I mean, Trump said this, and then we have to respond to that. And it's like, this was the reason why during the election, for me personally, I ended up just writing in Tulsi Gabbard's name. I essentially threw my vote away, but I knew that going in. And, gun to my head, in retrospect, probably would have went Joe Biden. The thing that really kept me from voting for Joe Biden was his choice of running mate, actually, was having Kamala Harris as VP was the nail in the coffin. I just was like, I just can't. But because I would say, I bet you, I always say this about Kamala Harris. I say two things about her, and that's, one is that every single terrible, weird, conspiratorial thing people have said about Hillary Clinton, I always have actually had a little bit of a defense where I'm like, I really never saw Hillary Clinton as uniquely evil. I kind of see her as a pretty typical politician. Kamala Harris, to me, is every terrible thing people ever said about Hillary Clinton. I'm always like, that's actually, that's like the boy who cried wolf thing, where she really is that kind of awful, cackling witch character. And the other thing I would say about her is what you said before about, like, if you could hand someone on a silver platter, like a successful coup attempt, and I imagine Donald Trump would probably accept that if he knew it would succeed. I very much see Kamala Harris as a character who would do the same. She really terrifies me in that way.
I agree. I was very distressed by that choice. I was hoping for Klobuchar. Yes, very much so.
And I probably would have voted for Joe Biden. And who knows, by the way, how much better he would have done in the election. Of course, he couldn't pick Klobuchar because she was the Hennepin County prosecutor.
Yeah, I mean, the evidence is pretty strong that vice president doesn't matter much. So I don't know that it would have changed the vote much. But it would have made, in the case of Biden especially, because he's so old, right? It's like Harris is a COVID germ away from the presidency. And I agree with you. If you look at her career, she's clearly evinced a kind of sociopathic Machiavellianism, and everything about her is fake. Her laugh, her affectation, you can just
it's really awful.
It's very off-putting, and there's a reason, I think, and she was rejected even by Democratic voters pretty strongly during the primaries, right? She crashed and burned because I think she kind of reminds me of a less talented and more sociopathic Rubio, in the sense that they both seem fake. And I think people can kind of just see that they're fake. So as to the question that Trump just squandered his opportunity to educate people, he's been doing that for 4 years. I mean, that's what he does. If you imagine if you had, and I was thinking about this when I watched the vice presidential debate, Mike Pence is just like an ordinary conservative who's a little more populist now, which I think is good. I think we need to take some of the populist concerns seriously. He's so much better at articulating these points in a way that feels human and actually could reach somebody who's on the fence, right? Because he seems empathetic. He recognizes, like when he talks about COVID, like when Trump talks about COVID, you can tell he doesn't care a lick about death. Nothing matters to him. It's where's the stock market and how will it affect my chances? Pence actually can express empathy. When he describes things, you get the sense that he's thought about it and that he cares about it, and the real human effect. If we had Pence, I would have happily voted for him.
Yeah.
Any
ordinary Republican.
Yes, exactly.
The bar is so low. But the thing I always end up shouting at the TV screen with Trump is, I ask you for so little. Like, I ask for nothing, and you deliver less than nothing.
Less. Yes. I think he's one of the most pernicious characters in politics in the last, I don't know how long, many years. And it's just sad to see conservatives who consistently argued, I think correctly, that character matters, ditch that in order to hitch to somebody whose character is completely malignant and consumed by egotism. It's really sad. And I guess, so major point on the tribalism thing, right, is you have to be fair about these things, and you have to criticize the conspiratorial nonsense that is getting spewed on the right, and the fact that not only is Trump not going to get impeached for this, but he's still incredibly powerful on the right, so much so that Marjorie Taylor Greene was promoting the fact that they just had a phone call, right? Because that's going to help her, right?
Yeah.
And Liz Cheney is getting more grief in the Republican Party for voting for impeachment than Marjorie Taylor Greene is, and she's absolutely insane.
Yeah.
Right? So this is, it's really too bad, because I don't know what you think about this, but what I think is part of the problem is that a lot of these, again, for lack of a better term, we'll call them IDW types, people that I really like for the most part. One problem I do think among the IDW, and it's been a problem since the beginning, is there's not a lot of interest in sort of concrete policies. So when you try to talk to these people about, like, well, what do you think we should do about immigration policy? Do you think we should cut asylum a bit or end chain migration or this or that? They don't even know what you're talking about. They don't care. They don't care about tax policy. What they care about is this sort of cultural grievance, which is fine. I care about that too, but that's like their one bête noire. The one thing they focus on is this just all out culture war. And when you do that, you leave aside all of these complicated policy issues, and you become a flamethrower instead of somebody who's willing to compromise because you want to get a piece of legislation through, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of what I see. And it's like, when you care about legislation, you have to compromise. You can't alienate the other side necessarily. You need to get people on board, persuade people, compromise, whatever. And I care a lot about that stuff too. And I think it matters a lot if we care about trying to pass working class policies, or, protecting our country from, let's say CRT, for example. Well, Trump does this via executive order. And the problem with doing it via executive order is once another president gets in, it's gone, because they're just going to do an executive order to overturn it. Right. And what I've said to these people, you have to persuade people that this is bad. You can't just executive order it away, because if people don't agree with that, let's say 80% of the population wants diversity training, then they're going to get it one way, shape, or another, right? You have to persuade them that this is really bad. And here's why it's bad. It ends up just being like this kind of anti-white racism, show them examples. Do what Rufo does, by the way. He does a good job of this.
I was actually just thinking that Christopher Rufo is one of the best examples of somebody who is trying to have a very direct impact legislatively or legally on, and it's obviously it's deeply related to and interconnected to the culture war. And this is something that, I really wish I could talk to Chris, because he has even started saying something that I've been saying for a long time, which is one of the first things we need, I think, is an internet bill of rights. Is essentially there needs to be some addressing of the fact that if we let the space where, frankly, speech is taking place in the modern age, which is discourse by and large takes place on the internet, if we let that be completely controlled by a group of big tech oligarchs and, Democratic politicians or Republican politicians for that matter, then we are going to very, very quickly lose control of the debate completely. And frankly, and just lose free speech. I mean, people make fun of the idea of internet bill of rights because it's the internet to them is this silly thing where they watch cat videos. But I always point out, like, it's actually something that has fundamentally changed every aspect of human interaction in life, to the point where look, we've amended the Constitution, 26 times? I forget how many times, but it's like, we should absolutely have an amendment to the Constitution that addresses the internet. It turned us into these interconnected, half human, half machines. Like, I don't see why there isn't more movement behind something like that. Because we're clearly not able to. I think the Constitution, as it stands, cannot handle the way that speech has changed. I think the First Amendment, it's not outdated because it's a bad idea. That's what like a woke person might say. Right. It's outdated just because it can't handle the lift it has been given by the communications revolution.
Yeah, because, so I'm more agnostic about this issue. That I should just say it's it's really complicated because, so let's just take an extreme example and work from there. So one proposal would be, yeah, we should just apply First Amendment jurisprudence and norms to, say, Twitter, right? That would be one solution, because you would argue Twitter is like the public marketplace.
Yep.
Okay. Now, does that mean that we have to allow KKK tweeters on there? Because if you're going First Amendment, you do, right? Because the KKK can get a license and they can march in a certain area or whatever and exercise their free speech rights. I'm not sure that I actually want them on Twitter, and I'm not sure that I would be terribly concerned that they're not on Twitter. So I'm not sure that applying First Amendment norms and jurisprudence would be the right way to go. What do you think about that?
I'm glad you asked. This is something I've wanted to talk to people about, and I've talked to people about privately, but actually not as much on this show. I'm very glad you asked me that. I'm actually generally, and I'll explain this very carefully because I ought to. I'm generally actually in somewhat disagreement with you on that point, in that I think it was Jordan Peterson, and he's not the only one. A lot of people have basically had the kind of free speech absolutist position that a good principle to follow would simply be, if the speech that is occurring on a platform it does not break any existing US laws, that it must be protected on some level. My general compromise is you certainly shouldn't have to monetize it. I think that every platform should have the option to demonetize anything and not partner with anything, but that you should not be able to delete it for the sake of free speech. And what I would say is sort of the safeguard to keep that from getting too out of hand is, let's take the worst case scenario. You have an awful racist, white supremacist person on Twitter or on YouTube. And let's say they even have a small following. They have 1 to 10,000 followers on one of these platforms. And look, nobody wants to see that. All right. No normal, reasonable person wants to see that. However, if they ever were to take it to the point where they are organizing some kind of illegal activity to harass a black family, to hurt a minority, to do something that really crosses that line into serious danger to society, that then it would be absolutely permitted for platforms to step in and to really bring the hammer down and permanently ban them from that platform. And that the thing that would be allowed, unfortunately, but I think essentially it is important that it is allowed, is for them to simply share their vile racist views. And I feel like I just can't think of too many options where you're going to say that what is at the end of the day sort of the political content of someone's opinions, if they maybe support an ethno state or something like that, that if you are going to say that that can be deleted because it's just distasteful or just it's awful, and I agree that it is, that I just don't see how you stop the slippery slope from taking place. I'm sure that there are some thoughts, but I feel like it's a trade-off for sure, and I think it's worth it, that if we can have an open discourse, and yes, some of the characters will be terrible, awful people on both sides of the political spectrum saying terrible, awful, bigoted things. I mean, I would argue that in some ways, Ibram Kendi and people on the left have said terrible, awful, bigoted things that I wish they couldn't say. But yes. So, you know, that's sort of a brief summary of my position, is that I think that there's a safeguard, because of course I would never want there to be organizing by a KKK or white supremacist terrorist cell to do illegal activity that would actually harm, whether it's minorities, white people, I don't care. I don't want any of that to take place. But I think that you would be able to, with just the principle of no laws can be broken, you'd be able to regulate that to some degree.
Yeah, so I agree with you that it's just it's a set of painful trade-offs, right?
Yeah.
So I think we just start from there and we're like, okay, there are trade-offs here. There's no perfect policy, obviously. So we have to figure out what's the best way to balance the trade-offs. I am sympathetic to the argument that you forwarded, but I'm not committed on either side. I mean, people find this, I guess, perplexing, but I'm not a free speech absolutist. I think, you know, look, I believe in First Amendment jurisprudence and I would support that, but I don't know how you handle online activity that's on a private company's system, right? I mean, so take a different one. Say I'd imagine you're familiar with incels.
Yes.
Yeah.
I actually did a series of videos about them.
Oh, okay, interesting. So I was interested in sort of incel ideology, if you will, and I would read these groups before they kind of crack down on them, and read the ideology, the rhetoric that they used with each other. And look, there's a huge trade-off here, because it is true that what would have been an individual who was disgruntled, maybe couldn't get a date, slightly mentally off, it goes from that lone individual to this ideology with all of these individuals contributing to it and feeding on it. And then it has a feedback effect, because now I get on and I see these other people and they have this ideology that I can absorb. And there really is that's probably dangerous. Now, do I want to limit speech to stop that? No, I don't. I don't like that idea. But I'm open to the fact that it's a really complicated issue, and I don't want to see incels on Twitter spreading their message and getting thousands upon thousands of likes. And I think the fact of the matter is, if you did have this sort of Wild West variant of Twitter, it would get polluted by that kind of stuff pretty quickly, because even as it exists now, a lot of the most extreme, the most obviously charlatan-like stuff gets promoted and liked and retweeted. It's already like disturbing. And if I'm Twitter, if I'm Jack Dorsey, I would be like, look, I don't want people's experiences to be, you log on to Twitter and this guy who's talking about how all women who aren't virgins are whores who only like chads and they deserve what they get. And that's getting, 15,000 retweets. That's a problem. So yeah, I don't know what the answer is there.
I think there's a certain level of curation of your own experience that is not only available to people, but it's sort of their responsibility, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's
especially
fair.
When you're choosing who you follow, who you block. I mean, you can even go so far as to block people. It reminds me of the debate sort of, I know that having been a gamer, we talked about this a little bit before the show because you saw my Zelda poster. I know for a fact that if you go into an Xbox Live, certainly when I was a teenager, if you went into an Xbox Live Call of Duty lobby, you'd hear the N-word being liberally used, to say the least. And then also if you were a woman, I knew girls that would play video games and they would immediately face a very high degree of harassment. But I also, I would bring up to these women, like, there is a mute button and there is a report button, and it's not particularly hard to avoid these. I mean, the mute button is it is literally a push button solution to this problem that solves it pretty effectively. But I mean, no, I definitely understand the concern with, I think I kind of have a strong counterpoint to that. And then I understand the concern with really bad ideas that can lead to really bad actions and really bad movements growing and festering on platforms that are completely unregulated. But my counterpoint to that would be, in an environment where the people in control of these platforms are incredibly one-sided in their ideology, what they're doing is letting that happen, but only if it's one flavor of extremism, which is the, I have a wolf avatar on Twitter and I think there's 80 genders and that anyone who disagrees with me is a fascist and I'll throw a brick through their window. They're Twitter just recently banned like 3 Antifa accounts. It was like the first time they took serious action against Antifa, even though that group has been in the public eye for 4 or 5 years. And then they're only using it one-sided. And so what I would say is, I think to an extent, my argument is we need to legislate for the moment. We need to address what is happening right now, which is that if we don't do something fast, there's an entire side of what is perfectly mainstream political opinion that's going to be utterly decimated and censored to the nth degree, while the other side is getting more and more extreme. And if we don't open up the debate hall so that there is essentially a free marketplace, which, yes, would have some downsides, but if we don't do that, things are going to very, very quickly start looking rather Orwellian, and they have started to. And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I pretty much.
So I mean, I think those are all fair points. I agree with you about, I'm very concerned because of the obvious ideological bias of these firms, and especially their younger woke workers. So I think Jack Dorsey is more of a sort of anarchist in his view of speech, but his workers are not. And so if you read like what led up to the Trump ban, that came from his workers pretty clearly. And it was something that he did only reluctantly. And that's a problem because you're right. You do get this extreme conspiratorial BS on the left, the systemic racist nonsense, etc., which is basically left-wing Q. And it's not only is it not banned, it's actively promoted by a lot of these people. And I don't like that. I agree with that. So that's definitely a concern. Now, I would say, I'm worried about some of the stuff with like transgender things, the way that you get banned for that. And that's why I largely stay away from that debate, because it's not my hobby horse. And I don't know what the effing rules are, right? Like, I don't know what counts as misgendering, etc. And that concerns me because that seems like just a legitimate ideological debate. And you shouldn't ban people for having the wrong views there, or about immigration or race differences and intelligence or whatever. I haven't seen, and I'm open to challenges to this, but I haven't seen examples of people who have my views really getting banned. Steven Saylor got blocked or suspended for tweets that I thought were perfectly legitimate, and I worry about that. I thought that that was a bad thing. But in many of these cases, I guess I'm just not. Now, let me say this and then add one thing to it. I'm not as concerned as some people are about it. However, let me say I do see the potential for harm, and I am concerned about that. And therefore, I would like absolutely transparent rules with a chance to appeal any of your suspensions or bans to an independent board somehow.
Right. Yeah.
That's what I would like to see. And it would be nice. And this would just have to go through government. This would be government meddling in a private corporation. But as you say, because these things are so, they're not like they're not like a consumer good industry or something. It's a completely different thing. I would like a body that has equal ideological representation that you could appeal to.
I would, in terms of examples of people with what are views that would be very much in the realm of our own, Megan Murphy, if you haven't heard of her, that would be probably the best example, because right. And that was as simple as her saying, she is a leftist feminist. It was as simple as her saying men cannot be women. I mean, that was, I think, verbatim the tweet. And then another example I would think of, because a lot of the people getting banned, I can totally see. Alex Jones was involved in actually illegal activity that was kind of an issue for him. He had legal problems. So, that was one of the first ones. But Articles of Unity, Brett Weinstein's Articles of Unity was deleted from Twitter for the crime of, trying to kind of come up with a third way political solution to our problems. And so, and kind of my general line on this that I always would say to kind of sum up my position to an extent is, if you give them a mile, they'll take a mile. Like, if you give the big tech oligarchs an opportunity to basically do whatever the hell they want, they will do terrible. Like, I just don't trust them 0.1%. I 100% am certain that if we give them a high degree of freedom, I think that they're so pernicious and so awful and insidious, the people at Facebook, the people at Google, the people at Twitter, based on their behavior, based on the way they've handled these situations as they've come up, that they are on definitely a sure path to destroying the any notion of free discourse on their platforms. And so what I'd say is, like, I think that, I mean, that's basically it, is that if we don't do something pretty drastic, we're going to see the sort of slow creep where they're getting more and more censorious turn into less of a creep. It's going to become an avalanche. And we have seen that a little bit these past few weeks. I mean, everyone has been losing tens of thousands of followers. If they have enough followers on Twitter, some kind of purge is taking place. And I think, like you've said, it's definitely a series of trade-offs. Nobody wants to have to occupy the same space in a forum as the most extreme, awful, racist people on either side of the aisle. But I don't know. I am very much okay with the idea of like somewhere on Twitter is some awful racist, like Richard Spencer type or whatever, which by the way, he had a Twitter until very recently, or might still have one. It's very bizarre. Nick Fuentes, I know, has one, and he said some interesting things.
And I don't know that I have so to your point, the Megan Murphy one, yes, I agree that is
that's probably the most clear cut.
Yeah. And that's what I say with the trans ideology is different. It does seem as though there are rules against making claims that I consider just biologically correct.
Right.
And that's a problem. I dislike that. And I do agree that there's definitely, you give a little bit of freedom, they will take more. That is definitely something that we should worry about. It happened in academia, for example, where the progressives began to take over more and more of academia and go a little bit further with their censoriousness. And then you get to the point where you can't even talk about certain issues, and journals have been infiltrated, and now they retract papers, etc. So it's a real concern. And I share that concern. I wish that on the sort of, let's call us the sort of heterodox centrist to conservative side, I do wish there was a little more recognition of the trade-offs in a healthy conversation, that there are costs to speech in certain areas. And so everybody accepts, for example, that you can't share nude pictures on Twitter. I mean, I'm sure there are some people who would like to, but by and large, you don't get a lot of complaint about that. And you can go one step further and say almost everybody accepts that you can't share pictures of adult child sexual behavior, even if they're drawings, right?
Right.
Now, you can't do that in the public either. The First Amendment doesn't even cover that, because that counts as obscenity, and there are different rules with that. But you can always make a slippery slope argument, right? That's always something you can say. You always end up having to draw lines somewhere, and then it's always a temptation to inch one way or the other, and that's always a problem. And I think we should be worried about that. But I still don't think First Amendment is completely viable with Twitter, because I do think it would injure Twitter. It would actually hurt their business pretty severely. And that's you talk about giving people power and tyranny. That's giving the government power to say to Twitter, you have to do this. And Twitter says, we don't want to, because that will hurt our business. People will leave. And the government says, too bad. Right. And I worry about that too. So like sort of underlying this, there's maybe like this abstract concern about power, and how do we deal with power, and how do you diffuse power, right, in such a way, because you're talking about big tech oligarchs. These are human beings who are no worse than anybody else. It just happens to be the case that maybe they have a bad ideology, right? I think that's one problem. But another problem is they just have a lot of power, right? And
right,
when you have a lot, but you know what? I actually think, like, Jack Dorsey strikes me as somebody who's probably better on a lot of these issues than many people. It's just he's stuck in this place where he has a lot of power and he has a woke workforce, right? And they start to demand
I don't think he has that much control at the end of the day. I think the shareholders, the board of directors, actually, Mark Zuckerberg made at least one very specific comment about his support for freedom of speech that was pretty coherent at one point. I remember he very much was saying, like, Facebook cannot be the arbiters of truth. Right. You can't necessarily mark. And I was like, oh, that's actually a very intelligent piece of commentary on this. And so I don't always target these specific people.
Right.
I think Google in particular, Susan Wojcicki at YouTube, I think is very just oblivious to actual issues of free speech in particular. But no, I think Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey are smart guys that my dream thing is, like, they end up on Rogan in a conversation with Brett Weinstein or Jordan Peterson. I wish they could just have a conversation. And but I think I like the point about, if you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, because you might actually just transfer the control over speech from these platforms to the government in a way that could also turn out very badly. Except that I feel like it's a question of, is it the government? Well, it's interesting because I guess the government can take two different kinds of actions in that they can say, here's something that you must do, and here's something that you can't do. And one is sort of a compelled action, and one is sort of a prohibited action. Mm-hmm. And what I was recommending, if I think about it for a minute, is basically that there is a prohibited action, which is that you can't, delete certain accounts. I guess I sort of think of it. Here's another point.
But there's a proactive action from the. So it's interesting because you're right. You're trying to you're prohibiting Twitter from doing something.
Right.
But what that means is that the government is actively telling Twitter.
They would have to enforce that.
Exactly. So it's like so suppose that at the National Review, you get a lot of comments that are nasty and like maybe they have some racial. Take this one. So the N-word's protected by the First Amendment. Like you can't arrest me for using the N-word in a pamphlet or something.
Right.
Do we want to allow people on Twitter to use it? Because I think Twitter would shed follower or users pretty quickly if everybody who wanted to use the N-word to troll people were allowed to. And for the government to say to Twitter, yeah, you're going to lose users, but too bad. We're telling you that you cannot use your own discretion to curate your experience for people. You have to follow the rules of the First Amendment, even though you're a private business. That's where it gets tricky, right?
I mean, I actually personally, I'm not sure that I 100% agree with the premise that some of these actions would result in a serious injury to Twitter. I like personally, I know that if people were DMing me the N-word to troll me, I'd block them. And and they'd be getting blocked pretty religiously, I think. Just like, because there are people, by the way, who send child pornography to people to try and troll. They send off, and they surely immediately get blocked or reported. Yeah. And I'm not sure how many people. I don't know that many people personally that I think if they were, if let's say once per Twitter sitting, they came across a particularly racist tweet because it came up in there, like, this person you follows liked or retweeted or whatever. And then maybe once, because most people aren't public figures who are getting a ton of DMs, maybe they get a DM with the N-word or whatever. I don't think it would really keep them from using Twitter. I think that because people are pretty darn addicted to the thing. I don't really think that it would necessarily have, I think the level of addiction people have to social media, I don't think it would have that big of an impact if there was a little bit more nonsense for them to deal with. And frankly, again, I think the trade-off would be worth it. If I was getting some DMs with the N-word, I would just block people, and I'd be glad that I can now say that men aren't women without fear of getting banned. I'll take that trade-off any day of the week.
Okay, but the trade-off isn't just that. It's also that you've empowered the government to tell a private business what it can and cannot do on its own site. And
that precedent is very, very
because
big.
Now, okay, so I understand that Twitter's different from the comment section at the New York Times or the National Review, but why do we draw where do we draw the line? And here's your a slippery slope point. Like, where do you draw the line with websites curating their pages?
I want to ask, do you know if a utility company, because one of the things that's brought up by this, and actually by someone like Elizabeth Warren on the left at times, is that maybe you make these things utilities.
Right.
And I want to ask, can an electric company, if they found out that Alex Jones or Richard Spencer was a user of their products, are they allowed to shut off their, I don't know if they are.
I don't think so. And people have made the argument about phone companies, which seems like the sort of, they want to make the claim, well, like, phone companies don't turn off like you can transmit.
Right. If I said the N-word to my friend over the phone, AT&T can't you don't have a phone anymore. And that's one way that I think of it. But obviously these are not utilities, but that's an argument in and of itself.
I think the hard thing is just to know, like, empirically, it seems to me that the real world consequences of allowing just like complete anarchy on some of these, that's a bad way to put it because it's sort of stacking the deck, to allowing like just wild open free speech might be more deleterious on the internet than it is on like phones or something, because we do have to accept, and this is an interesting thing. I actually come at this from a conservative point of view, which is to say, I think that humans are very flawed creatures, right? I don't have a very optimistic view of humans. I also don't think that the marketplace of ideas, I don't think the truth prevails in it necessarily, right? Like this view that, oh, well, you just throw all ideas out. Well, I think if you look at history, it suggests pretty clearly that, in fact, the truth doesn't win in those circumstances quite often. Now, obviously, there are problems with squashing ideas. That's a danger, and we should be very concerned about that. On the other hand, I worry about QAnon and other just crazy ass bullshit disinformation, and I don't know the answer. Again, I would love to just spend like 5 hours talking to you and we should get a group of intelligent people and have this conversation, because one thing I don't like about this one is it seems to be a sacred value among people that I associate with, whom I very much respect, that free speech absolutism is just, that's obviously the truth. And so a few times I have said things or tweeted things that suggested that I wasn't an advocate of free speech absolutism, and I get a lot of hostility to that. And I'm like, okay, well, now we can't even have a reasonable conversation because you're just calling me like a traitor to the cause or something,
Right.
Yeah.
There are some very pragmatic, simple, free speech exceptions that people are generally aware of. The most famous is shouting fire in a crowded building or filing a false police report or whatever it might be.
Right.
Unfortunately, Bo, we are out of time. I have to run. It's been about an hour and a half, but this has been an absolute
I can do
pleasure.
That for 5 hours.
Yeah, no,
let me just say, like, I share all of your concerns. I don't have strong opinions here. I'm open to
I can tell that. Still. No, you're exactly the kind of person I like to talk to you about this sort of thing. And I would say the same of myself, that I know I'm not 100% certain about these things. I like to sort of play the part as the more like pass the Internet Bill of Rights, do it now guy. I'm happy to kind of be that guy, but I take very seriously the concerns with it. But before we go, I just wanted to ask if there's anything you want to promote or plug.
Well, I would plug fund me on Patreon for a few months because I am unemployed for exercising my free speech and free inquiry rights. And what I'm doing now is I spend 10 hours a day doing research for this book that I hope to write in the next year. So I'm not just sitting around. I don't play video games or anything. Not that that's a waste of time. Not trying to denigrate
it. Can be.
It can be, yeah. But I don't do I don't even watch television. So.
All right. Well, yeah, if you fund Bo on Patreon, your money is going to good use. Definitely. I would check out his podcast. Follow him on Twitter. You're one of my favorite people to see on my Twitter feed, Bo. And thanks for being on the show. Thanks for listening. If you're listening today to Red Pill Nation, I'm Scott Veritas, and I'll see you next time.